April 7, 1945 dawned gray and cold over the scattered airfields of what remained of the Third Reich, carrying with it the bitter scent of defeat that had settled like a shroud across Germany. Major Klaus Bergmann stood at the edge of the makeshift runway, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of ersatz coffee that had long since gone cold, watching as ground crews worked frantically to prepare the last functioning Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters for what everyone knew would be their final mission. The young pilot beside him, barely 18 years old, fumbled with his parachute straps, his face pale in the pre-dawn light. "Herr Major," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible above the rumble of aircraft engines. "Are we really going up against 1,000 American bombers with just 40 of our planes?" Bergmann's jaw tightened as he studied the kid's face, seeing his own son's features reflected in those frightened eyes. The boy had been flying for less than 3 months, hastily trained in the desperate final push to get every available pilot into the air, part of what High Command had optimistically called Sonderkommando Elbe. "We follow orders, Lieutenant Miller," Bergmann replied, though his voice carried none of the conviction that had once fueled his speeches to young pilots. The truth was written in the smoke columns rising from Berlin on the eastern horizon, in the way their once proud Luftwaffe had been reduced to sending children into combat, with planes held together by spare parts and hope. He had witnessed the steady decline firsthand, from the glory days of 1940, when German fighters ruled European skies, to this moment, when they were preparing for what amounted to a suicide mission against overwhelming odds. The briefing had been delivered by Colonel Hans Joachim Hermann himself, though the man who stood before them bore little resemblance to the confident warrior who had once coordinated devastating night raids against British cities. Hermann's uniform hung loose on his frame, his once immaculate appearance now showing the strain of months of impossible missions and dwindling resources. "Gentlemen," he had announced to the assembled pilots, "intelligence reports indicate a massive formation of American 8th Air Force bombers approaching our positions. Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses and consolidated B-24 Liberators, approximately 1,000 strong, with fighter escorts." The numbers had sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with the April cold. 1,000 bombers meant devastation on a scale that would make previous raids look like minor inconveniences. It meant the systematic destruction of whatever remained of German infrastructure, the obliteration of cities already reduced to rubble, and the final nail in the coffin of any hope for organized resistance. Bergmann had done the mathematics in his head during the briefing, calculating fuel loads, ammunition counts, and the simple physics of 40 fighters against such overwhelming numbers. According to a PBS American Experience timeline documenting the air war from 1939 to 45, such desperate missions had become increasingly common as Germany's situation deteriorated. The reality facing Bergmann and his men was stark. Even under the best circumstances, with perfect weather, flawless coordination, and incredible luck, they might hope to down perhaps 50 of the approaching bombers before being overwhelmed. More likely, they would be swept from the sky like gnats, their sacrifice serving only as a footnote in the larger tragedy of the Reich's collapse. As dawn broke fully across the German countryside, Bergmann could hear the distant rumble that would soon grow into the thunderous roar of American Pratt and Whitney engines. The sound had become as familiar as his own heartbeat over the past months, the soundtrack to Germany's death throes. He thought of his wife Maria, evacuated somewhere to the south with their daughter, and wondered if they would even learn of his fate. The postal system had collapsed weeks ago, along with most other vestiges of normal life. "Sir?" Young Muller's voice brought him back to the present moment. The boy was standing beside his aircraft, waiting for the order that would send them all into the morning sky for the last time. Around the airfield, other pilots were completing their pre-flight checks, their movements mechanical and practiced despite the hopelessness of their situation. These were men who had sworn oaths to the fatherland, who had believed in something greater than themselves, and who now faced the ultimate test of that faith. Bergmann drained the last of his cold coffee and tossed the cup aside, watching it roll across the cracked concrete. In a few minutes, he would climb into his Messerschmitt for what he knew would be his final flight, leading 39 other men into a battle they could not win against an enemy that vastly outnumbered them. The weight of command had never felt heavier, yet there was a strange peace in knowing that the long struggle was finally nearing its end. The sound started as a whisper on the western horizon, barely distinguishable from the wind through the damaged hangar roofs, but Major Klaus Bergman recognized it immediately after 4 years of war. He had heard that particular rhythm countless times before. The deep mechanical heartbeat of hundreds of synchronized aircraft engines growing steadily louder. Within minutes, it would become the overwhelming roar of the United States Army Air Force's 8th Air Force, carrying enough destructive power to level entire city blocks. "All pilots to your aircraft," Bergman commanded, his voice carrying across the airfield despite the increasing noise. The morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing the patchwork of bomb craters that dotted the runway like ancient impact wounds. Ground crews scrambled to remove the last pieces of camouflage netting from the waiting Messerschmitt fighters, their movements urgent but practiced. These men had performed this ritual too many times, watching their pilots take off, knowing that many would never return. Lieutenant Mueller was still fumbling with his oxygen mask connections when Bergman approached his aircraft. The young pilot's hands were trembling, though whether from cold or fear was impossible to determine. "Remember your training," Bergman said, placing a gloved hand on the boy's shoulder. "Stay with your wingman, watch for the escort fighters, and aim for the bomber engines. One good burst into a right cyclone will bring down a flying fortress just as surely as a dozen scattered hits on the fuselage." The tactical situation they faced was unprecedented in its hopelessness. Intelligence reports suggested the approaching formation included not only the bombers, but also hundreds of North American P-51 Mustang fighters, Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, and Lockheed P-38 Lightnings. The Americans had learned from earlier encounters with German interceptors and now provided massive fighter escorts for their heavy bomber formations. Bergman's 40 aircraft would be outnumbered by fighter escorts alone. Never mind the defensive firepower of the bombers themselves. As he climbed into his own cockpit, Bergman caught sight of the photograph he kept tucked behind his instrument panel. Maria and little Anna, at their home in Bavaria, taken during a brief leave in 1943, when victory had still seemed possible. The house was gone now, destroyed in one of the countless Allied raids that had systematically dismantled German cities. His family was safe in a refugee camp somewhere in the Alps, but the life they had known together was as dead as the Reich itself. The Daimler-Benz DB605 engine of his Messerschmitt coughed to life, sending vibrations through the airframe that Bergman felt in his bones. Around the airfield, other engines were starting, filling the morning air with the smell of aviation fuel and exhaust. These planes had been hastily assembled from whatever parts could be salvaged from damaged aircraft, maintained by mechanics working with increasingly scarce resources. Some of the pilots were flying machines that had been shot down and rebuilt multiple times, patched together with aluminum sheeting, and held together by the skill of overworked ground crews. "Tower to all aircraft," the radio crackled, though tower was something of an exaggeration for the wooden shack that served as their control center. "Enemy formation bearing 270 degrees, altitude 25,000 feet. Estimated strength 1,000 plus. All units are cleared for takeoff." The matter-of-fact tone of the controller belied the enormity of what he was announcing. 1,000 bombers meant approximately 10,000 aircrew, more men than remained in many entire Luftwaffe units. Bergman pushed the throttle forward, feeling his fighter respond with the familiar surge of power that had once filled him with confidence. Now it felt almost mocking, this sensation of strength and speed in an aircraft that would soon be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. He had calculated the odds during the sleepless night before the mission. If every German pilot shot down 3 bombers before being killed or forced to withdraw, they might destroy 120 of the approaching aircraft. It would be their most successful interception in months, and it would still represent less than 15% of the enemy formation. The runway rushed past his wings as Bergman lifted off, banking sharply to the left to avoid the shell crater that marked the northern edge of the field. Behind him, the other Messerschmitts were taking off in pairs, their camouflaged forms barely visible against the scarred landscape. Some of these pilots had been with him since the early days of the war, veterans who had flown over Britain during the Battle of Britain and survived the brutal attrition of the Eastern Front. Others, like Muller, had been in training when Berlin fell to the Soviets just days earlier. As they climbed toward their interception altitude, Bergman could see the approaching formation on the horizon, a dark mass that seemed to cover half the western sky. The sight was both terrifying and oddly beautiful. Hundreds of aircraft flying in precise formations that spoke of American industrial might and organizational efficiency. Each of those bombers represented months of production by workers who had never seen combat, built in factories that had never known the sound of air raid sirens. At 23,000 feet with oxygen masks hissing and engines straining in the thin air, Major Klaus Bergman finally got his first clear view of what they were facing. The American formation stretched across the sky like a metallic cloud. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, arranged in combat boxes designed to maximize their defensive firepower. Each bomber carried 10 to 12 machine guns, and the overlapping fields of fire from a properly formed combat box could create a deadly crossfire that had claimed hundreds of German fighters over the past 2 years. "Mother of God," came Muller's voice over the radio, his young pilot's training momentarily forgotten in the face of such overwhelming numbers. Through his canopy, Bergman could see the boy's Messerschmitt weaving slightly as he struggled to maintain formation while staring at the approaching armada. The sight would have been daunting to the most experienced pilot, but for someone with less than 50 hours of combat time, it must have seemed like a vision of apocalypse. "Maintain radio discipline," Bergman commanded, though he understood the sentiment entirely. In all his years of combat, from the Polish campaign through the Battle of Britain and the desperate defense of the Reich, he had never seen so many enemy aircraft in one place. The Americans had learned to mass their forces into formations that could overwhelm any defense through sheer weight of numbers, and this appeared to be the ultimate expression of that doctrine. The tactical problems they faced were almost insurmountable. Traditional German fighter tactics called for high-speed diving attacks against bomber formations, striking quickly and withdrawing before the escorts could respond. But with 40 fighters against 1,000 bombers, even perfect execution would result in minimal damage to the overall formation. Worse, intelligence reports indicated that the Americans had developed new defensive formations specifically designed to counter such attacks, with lead aircraft carrying additional forward-firing guns and specialized radar equipment. According to a War History Online article about the final months of the Luftwaffe, German pilots in this period were often flying what amounted to suicide missions, with survival rates dropping below 20% for each sortie. Bergman had seen the statistics in his briefings. The average life expectancy of a new German pilot in April 1945 was measured in days, not months. The young men flying beside him represented the last generation of pilots that the Reich could produce, hastily trained replacements for veterans who had been steadily attrited away by months of hopeless combat. As they approached the bomber stream, Bergman could make out individual aircraft details. The lead elements appeared to be B-17G models, their ball turrets glinting in the morning sun, dorsal and tail gunners already tracking the approaching German fighters. Behind them flew the heavier B-24 Liberators, their twin tails distinctive against the sky. The Americans had painted their aircraft in olive drab and gray, practical colors that spoke to the industrial efficiency of their war machine. So different from the elaborate camouflage schemes that German aircraft had worn earlier in the war. "Enemy fighters high and to the west," called out Oberleutnant Schmidt, one of Bergman's more experienced pilots. Through the morning haze, Bergman could see them, flights of P-51 Mustangs positioned to sweep down on any German aircraft that attempted to attack the bombers. The Mustangs represented everything that the Luftwaffe had once been, but could no longer achieve: fast, well-armed, and flown by pilots who had completed extensive training before being thrust into combat. The American escort fighters were deployed in layers, with some flights flying high cover above the bombers, while others patrolled ahead of the formation, ready to pounce on any German aircraft that approached within range. Still more Mustangs and Thunderbolts flew alongside the bomber stream, ready to break away, and engage interceptors at a moment's notice. It was a textbook example of fighter escort tactics, the kind of coordinated defense that German formations had once provided for their own bombers during the early years of the war. Bergmann's radio crackled with position reports and tactical updates from his pilots, but underneath the professional communications, he could hear the tension in their voices. These men knew they were flying into a battle they could not win, yet they maintained their formations and followed their orders with the discipline that had made the Luftwaffe feared throughout Europe. Some were veterans who had survived dozens of similar missions, while others were barely out of training. But they all shared the grim determination of soldiers who had accepted their fate. The distance between the two formations closed with mechanical inevitability. In a few minutes, Bergmann would give the order to attack, and 40 German fighters would dive into the midst of the largest aerial armada ever assembled. Some would score kills, some would be shot down immediately, and a few might survive long enough to make multiple attacks. But regardless of individual heroics or tactical brilliance, the outcome was predetermined by simple mathematics. There were too many American aircraft and too few German ones for any result other than annihilation. The order came at exactly 1000 hours, delivered in Major Klaus Bergmann's steady voice despite the magnitude of what he was commanding. All units, attack, target the lead elements, and break on my signal. With those words, 40 German fighters dove toward the massive American formation, their engines screaming as they built up speed for what many knew would be their final combat engagement. Bergmann selected his target, a B-17 Flying Fortress flying in the lead element of the center combat box, its nose art depicting a blonde woman in a red dress with the name Memphis Belle II painted below. The irony was not lost on him that he was attacking an aircraft, named after what had become a symbol of American determination and industrial might. His Messerschmitt's cannon and machine guns were loaded with a mixture of armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds, enough ammunition for perhaps 30 seconds of sustained fire, if he was careful with his bursts. The American defensive fire began when the German fighters were still 2 miles away, streams of tracer rounds reaching out across the morning sky like deadly fireworks. The B-17 formations had perfected their defensive tactics over months of daylight raids, with each bomber's gunners trained to create interlocking fields of fire that could fill the air with lead. Bergmann watched as several of his pilots' aircraft were immediately bracketed by defensive fire, bright flashes of tracer rounds converging on their positions. Lieutenant Muller's voice cut through the radio chatter, high with excitement and terror. "They're everywhere, there's too many of them." The young pilot's Messerschmitt was visible off Bergmann's starboard wing, weaving erratically as he tried to avoid the streams of 50 caliber bullets filling the air around him. The boy had never experienced anything like this intensity of defensive fire, and his training had not prepared him for the psychological impact of flying through what amounted to an aerial artillery barrage. The first casualties came within seconds of initial contact. Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann, a veteran who had survived 3 years on the Russian front, simply vanished in a ball of flame as his aircraft took a direct hit from converging defensive fire. His Messerschmitt broke apart in mid-air, pieces of wing and fuselage tumbling toward the ground far below. There was no parachute, no radio call, just the sudden absence of an aircraft that had been there moments before. Bergmann pressed his attack despite the overwhelming defensive fire, closing to within 500 meters of his target bomber before opening fire. His cannon shells struck the B-17's port wing, sending bright sparks flying as they tore through aluminum sheeting and internal structure. The bomber's pilot immediately began evasive maneuvers, as much as a heavy aircraft could manage in formation, while the dorsal gunner swung his twin 50s toward the attacking Messerschmitt. The mathematics of aerial combat were playing out exactly as Bergmann had calculated. For every German fighter that managed to close with a bomber, dozens of American gunners were able to concentrate their fire on a single target. Even when German pilots scored hits, the rugged construction of American heavy bombers meant that many aircraft could absorb significant damage and continue flying. He watched as Lieutenant Franz Kessler put a burst of cannon fire into a B-24's engine nacelle, sending black smoke streaming from the damaged right cyclone. But the Liberator remained in formation. The American escort fighters were now entering the engagement. P-51 Mustangs diving down from their high cover positions to engage the German interceptors. The Mustangs had been positioned perfectly to respond to the German attack, and their pilots were clearly experienced veterans who knew how to coordinate their attacks for maximum effectiveness. Bergman saw two of his aircraft disappear under the guns of diving Mustangs before the German pilots even realized they were under attack. "Break off! Break off!" came the panicked voice of Feldwebel Hans Kruger, as his aircraft was bracketed by fire from 3 different American fighters. The veteran sergeant had flown over 100 combat missions, but even his experience could not overcome the numerical disadvantage they faced. His Messerschmitt was trailing white coolant vapor from its engine, a sure sign that he had taken damage to his cooling system and would be forced to land soon. Through his canopy, Bergman could see the full scope of the disaster unfolding around him. German fighters were being shot down faster than they could inflict damage on the American formation, their aircraft falling like autumn leaves while the bomber stream continued its inexorable advance toward its targets deep in Germany. Some of his pilots were still pressing their attacks with desperate courage, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Luftwaffe was dying in the skies above the Reich, and there would be no resurrection. The sound of his own aircraft taking hits brought Bergman back to his immediate situation. Something had struck his starboard wing, tearing a ragged hole in the metal and causing his Messerschmitt to pull to the right. His engine was running rough, missing on at least one cylinder, and his fuel gauge showed damage from shell fragments. Like so many of his pilots, he was going to be forced to withdraw from combat not by choice, but by the simple fact that his aircraft could no longer sustain flight. The sky above Germany had become a charnel house of twisted metal and burning aviation fuel, with the wreckage of Luftwaffe fighters scattered across 10 square miles of airspace. Major Klaus Bergman, his own Messerschmitt leaking coolant and running on 5 cylinders instead of 12, watched in grim fascination as the mathematical certainty of defeat played out in real time. Of his original 40 aircraft, more than half had been shot down or forced to withdraw in the first 10 minutes of combat. Lieutenant Muller's voice cut through the radio static, no longer the frightened whisper of a novice, but the calm report of a pilot who had accepted his fate. "My engine is gone, sir, going down southwest of Magdeburg." Bergman could see the young pilot's aircraft trailing a long plume of black smoke as it spiraled toward the earth below, its propeller windmilling uselessly. The boy had lasted longer than most of the replacement pilots, but not long enough to make any meaningful difference to the outcome of the battle. The American bomber formation continued its steady advance, barely disrupted by the German attack. Here and there, individual bombers showed signs of damage, engines feathered, bomb bay doors hanging open, or defensive gun positions silent. But for every bomber that showed battle damage, there were dozens more continuing in perfect formation, their crews methodically preparing for their attack runs on targets that Bergman could only guess at. The industrial might of America seemed infinite compared to Germany's dwindling resources. "Sir, we need to withdraw what's left of the Gruppe," came the voice of Hauptmann Ernst Bauer, one of Bergman's squadron leaders and one of the few pilots with enough experience to recognize a hopeless situation. Bauer's aircraft was still airworthy, though Bergman could see damage to his port wing and empennage from defensive fire. The captain was right. Continuing the attack would only result in the complete annihilation of their remaining aircraft with no corresponding benefit. But even as tactical logic demanded withdrawal, Bergman found himself reluctant to give the order. These might be the last German fighters to engage American bombers over the Reich, the final act of an air force that had once dominated European skies. There was something profoundly symbolic about the moment, though he could not articulate what that symbolism meant beyond the obvious fact that Germany was dying. The escort Mustangs were now hunting his remaining aircraft with methodical efficiency. Their pilots clearly experienced veterans who understood how to coordinate their attacks for maximum effect. Bergman watched as 2 P-51s bracketed Oberleutnant Klaus Richter's Messerschmitt, their combined fire literally tearing the German fighter apart in mid-air. Richter had been flying combat missions since 1941, a survivor of the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front. But his experience counted for nothing against overwhelming numbers and superior tactics. According to historical records from the PBS documentation of the Air War, German pilot losses in the final months of the war reached catastrophic levels, with entire squadrons being wiped out in single engagements like this one. The Luftwaffe had run out of everything: fuel, spare parts, experienced pilots, and time. What Bergman was witnessing was not just a tactical defeat, but the death of German air power itself. The damaged bombers were beginning to drop out of formation now, individual aircraft struggling to maintain altitude with damaged engines or wounded crew members. These stragglers represented the only viable targets for his remaining fighters, but attacking them would mean abandoning any attempt to disrupt the main formation. It was a perfect microcosm of the impossible choices that had faced German commanders throughout the final year of the war. Concentrate limited resources for maximum effect, or accept small victories while the enemy achieved his strategic objectives. "All remaining aircraft, form up on me," Bergman commanded, his voice carrying across the radio frequencies to the scattered remnants of his group. He could count perhaps 15 aircraft still airworthy enough to continue fighting, though several showed obvious signs of battle damage. Among them was Feldwebel Kruger, whose aircraft was leaving a thin trail of white vapor but still responding to controls, and Lieutenant Dietrich Müller, a replacement pilot who had somehow survived his first major engagement. The American formation was already passing beyond effective interception range, continuing toward targets deep in the German interior. Cities that had already been bombed dozens of times would be hit again. Infrastructure that barely functioned would be destroyed completely, and civilian populations would endure another day of terror from the sky. The strategic bombing campaign had already achieved its primary objectives months ago. What continued now was more akin to systematic demolition than warfare. As Bergman led his surviving aircraft away from the bomber stream, he could see smoke columns rising from multiple locations across the German landscape. Some were from crashed aircraft, both German and American, but others marked the ongoing destruction of what remained of the Reich's industrial capacity. The war would continue for a few more weeks or months, but its outcome had been determined long before this morning's engagement. The radio crackled with reports from his surviving pilots: damaged aircraft, wounded crew members, fuel states, and ammunition remaining. It was the professional language of military aviation, but underneath the technical terminology lay a deeper truth that none of them would speak aloud. They had just participated in the Luftwaffe's funeral. The improvised airfield that served as their base had been transformed during their brief absence, its scarred runway now dotted with the twisted wreckage of aircraft that had attempted emergency landings. Major Klaus Bergman counted 7 smoking hulks scattered across what had been their dispersal area that morning, some recognizable as Messerschmitt fighters, while others had been so thoroughly destroyed by fire that identification was impossible. Ground crews moved among the wreckage with stretchers and fire extinguishers, their faces grim with the knowledge that each piece of twisted metal represented a pilot who would not be coming home. Only 13 aircraft had returned from the morning's mission, and of those, 5 were so badly damaged that they would never fly again. Bergman's own Messerschmitt rolled to a stop near the operations shack, its engine finally giving up with a series of mechanical gasps that spoke of irreparable internal damage. Coolant leaked from punctured lines, mixing with aviation fuel on the concrete to create rainbow patterns that caught the afternoon light. The aircraft had brought him home, but it had paid the price for that final service. Lieutenant Müller was not among the survivors. Bergman had watched the young pilot's aircraft spiral into the earth southwest of Magdeburg, its engine compartment engulfed in flames and its propeller frozen. There had been no parachute, no last-second escape from the diving fighter. The boy had lasted 11 minutes in combat, long enough to see what he was facing, but not long enough to make any difference to the outcome. His family in Bavaria would receive a telegram informing them of his death in service to the fatherland, though what that service had ultimately accomplished was unclear. The debriefing was conducted in the same wooden shack that had served as their control tower, though with most of the pilots dead or missing, it was a remarkably brief affair. Hauptmann Bauer reported 3 confirmed bomber kills and 2 probables, while other surviving pilots claimed additional hits on American aircraft. Even if all their claims were accurate, which was unlikely given the chaos of aerial combat, they had managed to shoot down perhaps 8 bombers out of a formation that had numbered over 1,000. "What about the escort fighters?" asked Major Wilhelm Steinberg, the intelligence officer who had somehow survived 4 years of war despite never leaving his desk. The man seemed genuinely curious about tactical details, as if understanding the mechanics of their defeat might somehow make it more palatable. Bergman found himself wondering how someone could remain so detached from the reality of what was happening to their country. "They were everything we expected and more," Bergman replied, his voice flat with exhaustion. "Well-trained, well-equipped, and present in overwhelming numbers. Our pilots never had a chance to develop effective attack patterns because they were under fire from escort fighters from the moment we made contact with the bombers." He could have elaborated on the tactical sophistication of the American formations, but what would have been the point? The war was ending, and such knowledge would be useful only to historians. Outside the shack, he could hear the sound of approaching vehicles, ambulances, fire trucks, and the ubiquitous motorcycles that carried messages between scattered command posts. The infrastructure of military aviation continued to function, even as the aircraft it supported were systematically destroyed by enemy action or simple mechanical failure. Maintenance crews worked on the surviving Messerschmitts with dedication that bordered on the religious, replacing damaged components with parts salvaged from aircraft that would never fly again. Feldwebel Kruger appeared in the doorway, his flight suit stained with hydraulic fluid and his left arm hanging at an odd angle. The veteran sergeant had managed to land his damaged aircraft despite a wounded shoulder and an engine that had been running on 3 cylinders, a feat of airmanship that would have earned commendations in any other circumstances. Now it was simply another small victory in a war that was already lost. "Sir, radio message from headquarters," Kruger reported, extending a folded piece of paper with his good hand. The message was brief and to the point. All remaining aircraft were to be prepared for immediate transfer to bases further south, away from the advancing Soviet forces. It was another retreat, another admission that German forces could no longer hold their positions against enemy pressure. The war had become a series of such retreats, each one bringing them closer to ultimate collapse. The historical record, as documented in sources like the PBS timeline of the air war, would show that this engagement was typical of the final desperate months of the Luftwaffe's existence. Badly trained pilots flying worn-out aircraft against overwhelming enemy forces, achieving nothing beyond their own destruction. The strategic bombing campaign had already accomplished its primary objectives. German industrial production had been devastated, transportation networks destroyed, and civilian morale broken. What continued now was less warfare than systematic demolition. As evening approached, Bergman found himself walking among the wreckage scattered across their airfield. Each piece of twisted aluminum told a story. Here, the remains of Muller's aircraft, identified by a section of tail bearing his personal marking. There, fragments from Hoffmann's Messerschmitt, recognizable only by the distinctive camouflage pattern that had been his pride. These men had died believing they were defending their homeland, but what they had actually defended was an ideology that had brought nothing but destruction to Europe. The sound of more aircraft approaching from the west caused everyone on the airfield to look up nervously, but these were not American bombers returning for a second strike. Instead, they were the distinctive silhouettes of Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft, the workhorses of the Luftwaffe that had somehow survived 4 years of attrition warfare. They would carry away the surviving pilots and essential equipment, leaving behind the wreckage and the ghosts of better days. The evacuation began at dawn on April 8, 1945, with ground crews methodically destroying everything that could not be transported or might prove useful to enemy forces. Major Klaus Bergman watched as mechanics poured aviation fuel over the engines they had maintained with such dedication, preparing to ignite them rather than allow them to fall into American or Soviet hands. The sight was both practical and symbolic. The deliberate destruction of the Luftwaffe by its own personnel. The Junkers Ju-52 transports that had arrived during the night could accommodate perhaps half of the base personnel, which meant difficult decisions about who would be evacuated and who would remain to continue the destruction of equipment. Bergman found himself making choices that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Experienced mechanics were given priority over administrative personnel, while wounded pilots took precedence over those who could still walk without assistance. Feldwebel Kruger approached him as he supervised the loading of the transports, the veteran sergeant moving carefully to avoid jarring his wounded shoulder. "Sir, what about the operational aircraft?" he asked, gesturing toward the handful of Messerschmitts that remained airworthy after the previous day's disaster. The planes sat silent on the tarmac, their engines cold and their fuel tanks nearly empty, but they still represented the last remnants of German air power in this sector. "Fly them south if you can," Bergman replied, though both men knew it was likely a futile gesture. The handful of pilots still capable of flight barely had enough fuel for a one-way trip to the designated fallback positions, and there was no guarantee that those bases would still be operational when they arrived. The entire German defense structure was collapsing at an accelerating pace, with communication between units becoming increasingly sporadic. The sound of artillery fire was clearly audible from the east now, a continuous rumble that spoke of Soviet forces advancing more rapidly than German intelligence had predicted. Maps in the operations shack showed red arrows indicating enemy positions that were uncomfortably close to their current location, while blue arrows representing friendly forces seemed to shrink with each update. The war had entered its final phase, with German units fighting desperate delaying actions against overwhelming odds. According to historical accounts, including documentation from War History Online regarding Operation Bodenplatte and the final collapse of the Luftwaffe, this pattern was being repeated across hundreds of airfields throughout Germany. Experienced pilots and ground crews were evacuating their positions, destroying equipment that could not be moved, and retreating toward an uncertain future in southern Germany or Austria. The systematic destruction of German air power was as much the result of internal collapse as enemy action. As the morning progressed, Bergman found himself confronting the larger implications of what he had witnessed. The previous day's engagement had not been an isolated tactical defeat, but rather a microcosm of Germany's entire strategic situation. Outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of resources, German forces were fighting a war they could not win against enemies who possessed overwhelming advantages in men, material, and industrial capacity. The evacuation convoy formed up just after noon, a ragged collection of trucks, motorcycles, and staff cars, loaded with personnel and essential equipment. Many of the vehicles showed signs of previous encounters with enemy aircraft, patched bullet holes in canvas tops, spider-webbed windshields, and improvised repairs that spoke of desperate maintenance performed under combat conditions. It was a far cry from the mechanized efficiency that had characterized German military operations in the early years of the war. Before departing, Bergman took one final walk through the operations shack where he had planned so many missions over the past months. Maps still covered the walls, showing airfields that no longer existed, and unit dispositions that bore no relationship to current reality. Filing cabinets contained after-action reports documenting hundreds of sorties, most of which had accomplished nothing beyond the loss of aircraft and pilots. The accumulated paperwork of military aviation continued, even as the substance of air power evaporated. The last act was the most difficult, setting fire to the remaining aircraft that could not be flown out. Bergman personally ignited the fuel-soaked engine of his own Messerschmitt, the aircraft that had carried him through dozens of combat missions and brought him home safely the previous day. The flames caught quickly, consuming aluminum and steel with an intensity that seemed to mirror the destruction of everything he had believed in. The smoke from burning aircraft rose into the April sky like a funeral pyre for the Luftwaffe itself. Ground crews who had maintained these machines with loving care now stood watching them burn, their faces reflecting a mixture of practical necessity and profound loss. These men understood that they were not just destroying equipment, but erasing the physical remnants of their professional lives and military identity. As the convoy prepared to depart, Bergman climbed into the passenger seat of a battered Kubelwagen that had seen better days. The driver, a young corporal named Heinrich Weiss, had been assigned to the motor pool for less than a month, but already bore the hollow-eyed expression of someone who had seen too much destruction. The boy could not have been more than 17, conscripted from a training unit that had been dissolved when enemy forces overran its base. "Where are we going, Herr Major?" Weiss asked as he started the vehicle's engine. It was a reasonable question, but one for which Bergman had no complete answer. Their orders directed them to a fallback position near Munich, but communication with higher headquarters had become increasingly unreliable. For all they knew, Munich itself might be under enemy occupation by the time they arrived. "South," Bergman replied simply, watching as the last transport aircraft lifted off from the damaged runway. The Junkers struggled to gain altitude with its heavy load of evacuees, its twin engines laboring in the thin air. Behind them, the airfield was already being consumed by the fires they had set, black smoke marking another small chapter in the collapse of the Third Reich. The convoy moved slowly through countryside that bore the scars of 4 years of total war. Villages had been reduced to rubble by repeated bombing raids, their inhabitants evacuated or dead. Fields that should have been green with spring crops were instead cratered with unexploded ordnance, while roads were pocked with shell holes that made travel treacherous. This was what total war looked like when it came home to the aggressor, systematic destruction that left nothing untouched. They passed refugee columns moving in the opposite direction, German civilians fleeing the advancing Soviet forces with whatever possessions they could carry. Families pushed handcarts loaded with furniture and clothing, while elderly people struggled to keep pace with younger relatives. The sight was a stark reminder that the collapse of German military resistance meant suffering for millions of innocent people who had played no role in the decisions that led to war. April 15, 1945, found Major Klaus Bergmann in a displaced persons camp near Garmisch-Partenkirchen, surrounded by the human debris of a collapsing military machine. The promised fallback position had proven to be nothing more than a collection of tents and temporary shelters, hastily erected to accommodate the flood of military personnel retreating from untenable positions across Germany. Here, Luftwaffe pilots sat alongside Wehrmacht infantry, panzer crews, and naval personnel, all united by the common experience of serving a cause that had led only to destruction. The news of President Franklin Roosevelt's death on April 12th had briefly raised hopes among some of the German military personnel that the Western Allies might reconsider their demand for unconditional surrender. But those hopes had been quickly dashed as Allied forces continued their relentless advance, with American and British units racing toward the heart of Germany, while Soviet forces closed in on Berlin. The war would end soon, but not in any manner that could be construed as favorable to Germany. Feldwebel Kruger found Bergman sitting outside his tent, reading a letter that had somehow reached him through the chaos of the collapsing postal system. The veteran sergeant's arm was still in a sling, but his wounds were healing slowly despite the lack of proper medical facilities. Many of the injured personnel in the camp were receiving only basic first aid, as medical supplies had become as scarce as aviation fuel or ammunition. "It's from Maria," Bergman explained, holding up the letter. "She and Anna are safe in a camp near Innsbruck. The Americans reached them last week." There was relief in his voice, but also something deeper. The recognition that his family's safety now depended on the mercy of the enemy forces that had spent 4 years trying to kill him. The irony was not lost on either man. The letter contained other news as well, reports from civilian sources that painted a picture of systematic destruction across Germany. Cities reduced to rubble, transportation networks completely disrupted, and industrial facilities either destroyed by bombing or dismantled by advancing Allied forces. The Germany that would emerge from this war would bear no resemblance to the nation that had embarked on conquest just 6 years earlier. "Do you think it was worth it, sir?" Kruger asked, settling carefully into a folding chair beside Bergman's tent. It was a question that both men had been avoiding, but the approaching end of the war made it impossible to ignore any longer. They had served faithfully, followed orders without question, and lost friends and comrades in service to a cause that had brought nothing but devastation to Europe. Bergman considered the question carefully before responding. He thought of Lieutenant Müller, barely 18 years old when he died in the cockpit of his Messerschmitt over Magdeburg. He remembered Oberleutnant Hoffmann, a skilled pilot who had survived years of combat, only to be killed in a hopeless mission against overwhelming odds. These men had died believing they were defending their homeland, but what they had actually defended was an ideology that had started a war it could not win. The men who served did their duty, he said finally, but the cause they served. He left the sentence unfinished, unable to articulate thoughts that were still forming in his mind. The professional military virtues of courage, loyalty, and sacrifice had been corrupted by service to leaders whose ambitions had exceeded their judgment. Good men had died for bad reasons, and the recognition of that fact was more painful than any physical wound. According to historical documentation from sources like the PBS American Experience, the final collapse of German resistance would come within weeks of this conversation. Adolf Hitler would commit suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30th, and Germany would surrender unconditionally on May 8th. The war that had consumed Europe for 6 years would end not with heroic last stands or negotiated settlements, but with the simple collapse of German military and political authority. The sound of approaching aircraft caused everyone in the camp to look up nervously. But these were Allied reconnaissance planes conducting routine flights over territory that was now firmly under their control. The sight of American or British aircraft no longer triggered immediate preparations for air raids because there were no longer any German installations worth bombing. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, its aircraft destroyed and its pilots scattered or dead. As evening approached, Bergmann found himself thinking about the 1,000 American bombers he had faced with 40 German fighters just 8 days earlier. The mathematical impossibility of that mission now seemed like a metaphor for Germany's entire strategic situation. Too few resources committed against too many enemies, with predictable results. The courage of individual pilots and the skill of their commanders had been irrelevant in the face of such overwhelming disparity. The war had taught him that individual heroism, no matter how genuine or self-sacrificing, could not overcome fundamental strategic mistakes. Germany had started a war against enemies who possessed greater industrial capacity, larger populations, and access to resources that the Reich could never match. The tactical brilliance of German military operations in the early years had merely delayed the inevitable reckoning with those basic realities. In the distance, he could see the lights of American military vehicles moving along the roads that had once carried German convoys toward their objectives. The occupying forces were establishing their own administrative systems, processing prisoners of war, and beginning the massive task of rebuilding a continent that had been systematically destroyed by 6 years of total war. It would be a long process, but it would be conducted by the victors rather than the vanquished. The letter from Maria lay folded in his pocket, a tangible connection to a future that remained uncertain, but was at least no longer dominated by the daily possibility of violent death. His family had survived, as had he, and perhaps that was enough. The Third Reich was ending not with the dramatic finale that its propaganda had promised, but with exhausted men sitting in refugee camps, contemplating the wreckage of their beliefs and the uncertain prospect of rebuilding their lives under foreign occupation.